Something was wrong with the house that Leland French bought. Leland was a direct descendant of Robert Timothy French, the man who created French's mustard, and in 1985 he decided to use his inheritance to buy an old townhouse in Vicksburg, Mississippi. This house was ancient, the first section of it having been built in 1797, but it was very well preserved, and it was absolutely beautiful. However, in spite of that, French noticed that his neighbors seemed to be terrified of the place. Some of them even refused to ever set foot on the property, and it wasn't long before he found out why. According to Leland, doors and windows would slam shut all by themselves. Lights would flicker on and off, and there would be strange bumps and moans heard throughout the house at night. Every so often, he would find a stranger walking around his home, but when he chased them down, they seemed to just disappear before his very eyes. One day, Leland was cleaning something on the floor when an invisible force slammed his head into the floor so hard that it broke his nose. After that, he had finally had enough, and he moved away. Leland left behind everything he owned, his house, his belongings, and a small fortune's worth of paintings, silverware, antiques, and Civil War artifacts, and he never came back. Later, when he was asked why he decided to just uproot everything and leave, Leland French had a very simple answer. He had been chased out of the house by the ghosts. This is Legend Has It. I'm your host, Michael Walker, and the legends about the McRaven House just might be true. I mentioned earlier that the first section of McRaven was built in 1797, and that's important because the house has changed hands several times over the past 2 centuries and is actually split into 3 distinct sections from 3 different time periods: 1797, 1836, and 1849. The first section was built in 1797 by a man named Andrew Glass. Glass was a highwayman from a time when Vicksburg was still known as Walnut Hills, a small settlement on the banks of the Mississippi River that used to belong to the Spanish. Andrew would swoop in and rob people traveling along the Natchez Trace, while that area was considered French territory, and then slip back into the dense forests of Walnut Hills, where he would make camp and lay low for a few days before striking again. The French couldn't touch him. Even if they knew where Andrew had run off to, he was, essentially, in a whole other country. They couldn't just come in and detain him. Andrew practiced this routine for years, robbing the French and then stowing away into the forest, until the French decided to try something else. They paid the Spanish government to capture Glass, but the Spanish decided they weren't too interested in catching the bandit, so they made him a deal instead. They gave Glass a 1,200-acre plot of land to live on and enough bricks to build himself a house. All he had to do was give up his life of crime and become a respectable man. And Andrew Glass couldn't even do that. He built the cheapest accommodations possible, a 2-room, 2-story building with a wooden balcony around the second-floor bedroom where he lived. He didn't have any stairs. Instead, the balcony had a rope ladder that he would pull up every night so that he wouldn't be ambushed. He laid the bricks to the house himself, and then made plaster out of a combination of buttermilk and horsehair, and then painted the house with crushed blueberries. The land around the house just remained unused. And I'm sure you won't be surprised to learn that Andrew never stopped being a highwayman. No, he continued to rob people traveling through the Natchez Trace until one day he was shot in the stomach by a Frenchman he attempted to rob. He managed to get away, but that gunshot wound spelled doom for Andrew Glass. It was only a matter of time. Glass pulled himself back onto his horse and rode back home, where he managed to make his way up the rope ladder to his house and into his bed on the second floor. Glass had married a local girl by the name of Mary. He never loved Mary. He only got engaged to her to dissuade rumors that he was still robbing along the trace. Mary had no idea about the crimes Andrew committed, so she was shocked to find him bleeding out on his bed when she got home. She begged and pleaded with Andrew to please tell her who shot him, and he got furious. In his delirious state, he admitted to his wife that he was a criminal and that he never loved her, and that she had better pack up her things and leave. Mary knew she couldn't just do that, however. It wasn't because she loved him. No, she knew that if Andrew died, all of the money he owned would go to someone else, since women didn't receive inheritance from their husbands at that time. But that would only be the case if people knew Andrew was dead. While Andrew was fading in and out of consciousness, too disoriented to do anything to stop her, Mary slit his throat, and he bled to death. According to the stories, she had 2 hired helpers chop Andrew's body up into pieces, which she then scattered all over the 1,200 acres of land. However, if you ask some of the people who have visited McRaven, they'll tell you that Andrew still resides in the house. In the years after his death, people have reported strange occurrences in his bedroom. Items in Andrew's room have been known to move all by themselves, and every now and then, guests swear they hear big, bulky boots clunking along the wooden floor. Andrew's been known to grab people by the back of the neck, and visitors claim to leave Andrew's room feeling nervous for no discernible reason. The McRaven House hosts ghost hunts, and they use devices that are supposed to be able to read EMF waves, which they say ghosts are able to manipulate and produce words for the spirits to communicate with the living. Visitors who've used these devices in the glass room have been met with angry warnings, insults, and threats from the highwayman's ghost. Some guests have even reported valuable items like jewelry being pickpocketed off of their person, only to be found later in little stash holes in Andrew's room. Rumor has it that Andrew Glass was a bit of a womanizer when he was alive, and apparently not much has changed since his death. Women who have gone on tours of the house have felt invisible hands grabbing them inappropriately. In fact, according to one tour guide at McRaven, he had to stop a tour of Andrew's room when he realized that none of the guests were paying attention to him. Instead, they had all turned their attention to a woman in the back of the group, and they all watched in horror as the buttons on her shirt slowly began to undo themselves. Historically speaking, the McRaven House is one of the most important landmarks in Vicksburg. It's been called the time capsule of the South in reference to the 3 sections of the house. But aside from that, Andrew Glass's section is the oldest standing structure in all of Vicksburg. Not only that, but after Andrew Glass died, the house and surrounding property were sold to a Methodist preacher named Newitt Vick. While Newitt was alive, he began quartering off portions of the 1,200 acres in order to incorporate a town. The area was later named Vicksburg in honor of him. In 1836, Sheriff Stephen Howard bought the house and added a second addition to it, which included a master bedroom on the 2nd floor. Stephen was the first sheriff in the town of Vicksburg. He bought and remodeled the house as a present for his new bride, Mary Elizabeth, who was only 12 at the time, while he was pushing 28. Later, when Mary Elizabeth was 15, she gave birth to her and Stephen's first and only child, a girl named Karen. Unfortunately, Mary died just a few weeks later due to complications with the birth. Stephen was in absolute anguish. He didn't know what to do with himself, and so he took baby Karen to go live with his parents out in Yazoo City, and he abandoned her there. It's this painful and tragic set of events that has led people to think Mary Elizabeth might be bound to the upstairs bedroom. Visitors have captured pictures of orbs, a classic telltale sign of ghostly activity, flittering across the room. There have also been pictures taken from outside the house that clearly show a woman with dark hair and a brown dress, standing in the window of the upstairs bedroom, despite the fact that no one was in the house at that time. and every now and then you might catch a faint flowery scent like a perfume, but with no discernible source. There's a wooden cabinet to the side of Mary's room with a door that cannot completely close. The cabinet door is usually left open, but it's said that when Miss Mary sees one of her favorite guides or she hears something that she likes, she'll swing the door shut by herself. Tour guides also say that Mary has a soft spot for mothers and pregnant women. Mothers say they feel a kind, welcoming presence when they enter Mary's room. One tour guide recounts a time when a woman and her mother were the only two people on a tour of the house. The younger woman complained that she kept feeling a sensation along her abdomen, as if someone was rubbing their hand on her stomach. Not wanting to be rude, the tour guide asked if he could ask her a very personal question, and when she said yes, he asked her if she was pregnant. She insisted she wasn't, but wondered why he would think such a thing, and he told her about how Mary Elizabeth tended to act kindly towards expecting mothers. They finished their tour, and the women went home. Before the end of that month, the phone rang at the McRaven House, and that same tour guide answered the call. The young woman was on the line. She wanted to tell the guide that after her tour of the house, she had gone to the hospital to receive a standard physical, and the doctors had given her some very shocking news. She was 6 weeks pregnant. While we're here, I do want to tell you a personal story. The tour guides at McRaven also claim that Mary Elizabeth likes rearranging the furniture in her room. As of the time of this recording, I am one of those tour guides. I am currently working at the McRaven House. One night, I went along to help with a ghost investigation. We had 20 guests. Altogether, we had 4 tour guides. Late in the night, everyone was gathered on this side porch to listen to a demonstration about how the ghost hunting equipment worked. The crowd was so large that some people had to move into the dining room to make sure that they could hear the presentation. I was one of those people. During the presentation, all of the people in the dining room with me heard a weird noise coming from upstairs in Mary Elizabeth's room. Wood scraping against wood. I, of course, led the charge to go see what was going on. Everyone was supposed to be downstairs. Absolutely no one was supposed to be up in Mary's room. When I got up there, I found that one of the sitting chairs in Mary's room had been placed directly in front of the doorway, blocking off the entrance. There was also a trundle bed that we keep under Mary Elizabeth's bed. That is supposed to remain completely under Miss Mary Elizabeth's bed, but when I got up there, I found that it had been dragged all the way out to the side of the room. The house was sold again to a businessman named John H. Bobb in 1849. John owned 8 plantations, as well as several brick factories, and he was incredibly wealthy. He added the third and final section of the house, which included a bedroom and a gentleman's quarters on the 2nd floor, a front porch with a 2nd floor balcony, and a parlor room where he would hold lavish parties. He also had a substantial amount of land around his house, in which he planted an 11-acre rose garden that he tended to all by himself. Apparently, one of Bob's favorite pastimes was to step out onto the 2nd floor balcony at the front of the house, light a cigar, and look out over his beautiful garden. Things were peaceful at the McRaven House for a time, but then the Civil War broke out, and Vicksburg was dragged right into the thick of it. The Union wanted to divide the Confederacy, as well as take over their main source of trade, the Mississippi River, but the river was safeguarded by Vicksburg. Union General Ulysses S. Grant tried to execute a direct takeover of the city in the winter of 1862, but his forces were overwhelmed by the Confederates, and they were forced to retreat. Then, on May 18, 1863, after taking over some smaller Confederate forces in the area, Grant managed to block off all trade routes to Vicksburg. The city was under siege, and would be for the next 47 days. During that time, John allowed the Confederate Army to use his land as a field hospital. and he and his wife Selena hid in the root cellar underneath the house. Many soldiers who were shot ended up at risk for severe infections since the bullets that shot through them were made of lead and could easily lead to lead poisoning. There wasn't really a way to treat the infections, so their only option was to have their limbs amputated. There wasn't any painkillers lying around like morphine to help the soldiers deal with the pain of their surgeries. Instead, soldiers might be given a swig of whiskey before their operation, but if there wasn't any to give them, they had to bite down on a bullet while the surgeon sawed off their arm or leg. Today, the McRaven House has a display with several of these bullets, and you can actually see the teeth marks pressed into the metal. If ever there was a silver lining in this situation, it was that the procedure didn't last that long. Most surgeons could saw off an entire limb in as little as 45 seconds. After the limb was removed, it was tossed out into the yard and later buried. Sometimes the soldiers didn't survive their surgeries, and they were also buried on the plot, where they remain to this day. On occasion, after an especially heavy rainstorm sweeps through Vicksburg, human bones might be found in the yard, rising up out of the mud. During the Union occupation of Vicksburg, John Bobb was patrolling his grounds when he found a group of drunken Union soldiers in his flower garden. Bobb yelled at the men and told them to leave, but they refused and started yelling back at Bobb. Enraged, he picked up a loose brick from the yard and hurled it at one of the soldiers, hitting him right in the head. The other soldiers carried him back to camp, but they warned Bobb that they would be back. Fearing the worst, John made a trip that afternoon to visit General Henry Slocum. He apologized for the incident involving the soldiers, but Henry Slocum told him not to worry about it. He told John to go home, and that no harm would befall him. John Bobb never returned home that day. Late that night, he found a group of 25 Union soldiers standing outside his house. They grabbed John and they restrained him and dragged him to the nearby Stouts Bayou, where they shot him, once in the back and once in the head. Ever since that day, there have been reports of strange goings on in the Bobb bedroom. People who visit often see the visage of Mr. Bobb standing in the room, but more often than not, they actually see him standing out on the balcony, as if he was looking over his beautiful rose garden, much like he did during his life. Concerned neighbors have actually called the police to the McRaven House several times in the dead of night, claiming they see a man in a business suit smoking a cigar out on the front balcony. In fact, that's not the only weird thing regarding the balcony. People who have visited the McRaven House and been inside John Bobb's room claim to see a man walking just outside the window on the side of the house. The Bobbs used to have a wraparound balcony on the front portion of their house, but both of the portions on the side were destroyed during the siege of Vicksburg, meaning that whoever these guests are seeing is walking by on a balcony that no longer exists. The house was sold again in 1882 to a man named William Murray, his wife Ellen, and their 7 children. 2 of those children, their youngest daughters Annie and Ella, would inherit the house after William and Ellen passed away, and they lived there until 1960. The 2 sisters are famous fixtures in McRaven lore because they staunchly refused to incorporate modern amenities into the house, like electricity or running water. They continued to wear clothes fashioned in the late 1800s style, despite living well into the mid-1900s. The sisters also continued using old-fashioned practices to make day-to-day items. They would often be seen making things like soap in their front yard. The house fell into disrepair as the sisters got older. They weren't even able to climb the stairs to the 2nd floor of the house, and that area went untouched for several years. Trees and bushes went uncut in the yard for many years, and sometimes things would start growing in the house, as if the earth was trying to swallow up McRaven, with the sisters still inside. Things got so bad that eventually the house was no longer even visible from the street. Children who lived nearby would stumble onto the property while exploring the local woods, and would find these 2 elderly women in black dresses making soap in their front yard in a giant black cauldron. Unsurprisingly, they started spreading rumors around the local playgrounds that Ella and Annie might be witches. Ella passed away in 1960, and her sister Annie sold the house that same year and spent the rest of her days in a nursing home. The Bradways were the next family to move into McRaven, and they were the first to turn it into a tour home. Leyland French later bought the house in 1985, but he immediately began experiencing strange happenings in the house. One persistent issue he had was with the large wooden door in the parlor room, but in order to understand what I mean by that, we'll have to discuss a pretty odd funeral tradition. See, the Murrays did what a lot of people did throughout the 1800s. They would hold wakes in their home when a family member passed away. They would take the large wooden door in the parlor room off its hinges, set it on stands in the middle of the room, and then rest the deceased on top of the door for a wake. Once the funeral was over and the deceased was buried, they would finally hang the door back up. This was done for William Murray's funeral, and then for Ellen's, until only 3 were left. Later in life, Annie and Ella's brother Harry Murray was staying with them for a while when he passed away in the house. And so the sisters did as they had seen everyone around them do many times before. They took the big wooden door off its hinges, set it in the middle of the room, rested their brother on top of it, and they had a wake. People came from all over Mississippi to visit Harry Murray, including the family doctor, who paid his respects to Murray, then gave Annie and Ella a quick physical before taking his leave. This doctor came back 6 weeks later, looking to visit the sisters again. He knocked on the front door, but when no one answered, he let himself in, and when he did, he was hit with the most foul stench imaginable, the strong, unmistakable scent of death. Looking for a source, he stumbled into the parlor room and found a truly gruesome sight. You see, Ella and Annie, being 2 of the youngest Murray children, were never actually put in charge of disposing of the body. There was always someone else around who came along and tended to the body after the wake, so once all the guests had left, neither of them really knew what to do with Harry. So they decided not to do anything. They just figured someone else would come and take him away. Harry's corpse spent the next 6 weeks putrefying in their parlor, rotting away in the heat of the sweltering Mississippi sun. The body was so badly decayed by the time it was found, they had to scrape parts of Harry Murray off the door before they took his body to be buried. The sisters, wanting to save a few dollars, quickly sanded, repainted, and hung that big heavy door back up on its hinges. In the years since, that door has had a problem staying completely open. Apparently, the way that it's hung up, if the door is pushed all the way open, the side that Harry would have been lying on is pressed up against the wall, and some people think this irritates his spirit. They believe his soul is somehow bound to that door, and keeping it opened all the way like that is, well, squishing him. And he doesn't seem to like that very much. Visitors through the years have claimed to see the door push itself close, as if by an invisible force. While he was staying at McRaven, Leyland tried to keep the door open so that he could have air circulating through the house at night, but each time he left the door open, he would come back the next morning and find the door completely closed. One day, Leyland decided to prop the door open, using a shard of cannonball and a heavy piano stool. He set both of them in front of the door and then went upstairs to bed. He came downstairs the next morning and went into the parlor, only to find Harry's door once again completely shut, and the piano stool and the cannonball had been tossed clear to the opposite side of the room. Leyland didn't believe in the ghosts, at least not at first. When he first bought McRaven, Leyland continued the legacy of using the house as a tour home. He did live in the house, but he didn't do so until years of giving tours of McRaven. He acquired many artifacts that would have been true to the time periods in which each section of the house had been built, as well as many Civil War artifacts that he had found while metal detecting around the property. Leyland was known to give way-of-life tours that lasted up to 2 hours long, just about the artifacts he had found. Anyone who knew Leyland would say he considered himself a very rational man. He wasn't superstitious and was known to brush off the ghost stories that people told him about his new house. But as you remember, Leyland abandoned McRaven in 2008. He had over 20 years to become acquainted with the spirits that he shared his home with. He even started writing down his own personal accounts of the house in a book that he handed out to guests. And one of those accounts comes from the very first night he decided to spend at McRaven. On his first night sleeping in the house, Leyland was walking down the front staircase in the main foyer to lock the house up when he saw a man standing at the bottom of the stairs. They both froze and stared at each other for what must have seemed like forever. They honestly both seemed shocked to see the other man standing before them, and Leyland got a good, solid look at the man's face. The stranger took a step towards Leyland, and Leyland turned and ran back up the stairs, shutting himself in John Bob's master bedroom. He waited there for the rest of the night, sitting on the bed, waiting for the doorknob to turn and someone to come in after him. But nothing ever happened. He didn't hear another sound for the rest of the night, and when he finally worked up the courage to leave his bedroom the next morning, he found that everything was just as he had left it. Nothing had been moved, nothing had been stolen. Leyland breathed a heavy sigh of relief. He had survived having an intruder in his house completely unscathed, and the burglar hadn't even taken anything. But then Leyland looked up at the wall of the parlor room and stopped dead in his tracks, because there, resting on his wall, was a picture of the very man who had broken into his house. It was a painting of William Murray, a man who at that point had been dead for nearly 100 years. The Legend Has It podcast is researched, written, and produced by me, Michael Walker. All music and sound effects come courtesy of freesound.org, and all of the links will be in the show notes, along with the sources cited. A quick round of thank yous. First off, I would like to thank my good pal Tristan for supporting us over on Anchor.com. Also, thank you to my buddy Nate Brislin of the Association for Cryptozoological Fieldwork and Analysis group on Facebook for giving us a place to share our episodes once we get them uploaded. And finally, a big thank you to my wonderful boss over at the McRaven House, Mrs. Kendra Reed, for helping us edit the script for this episode. She helped me do some fact checking and edited the script for me, and I just want to say thank you, Miss Reed. We could not have put this episode together without you. But other than that, you know you can listen to us over on YouTube, Anchor Podcasts, and Spotify. And please, if you like the show, leave us a like, a comment, or a review. All of it helps our channel to grow, which is great because not only does it help us tell you more of the scariest true stories on the internet, but we've also got some new content we're going to start rolling out. I've been working on the first episode of a brand new YouTube exclusive video series called The Pseudoscience of, where we'll be discussing the actual real-world science that can be used to prove or disprove claims of the paranormal. I'm looking forward to sharing it with you guys. I'm looking forward to you guys seeing it, so please keep an eye out for that. You guys can keep up with the show on Instagram over at Legend Has It Pod. And if you feel like supporting the show, I'll put a link to our Patreon in the show notes. And I'm going to go ahead and address it. This next episode is going to be a little different. We're going to be discussing a very serious issue, one that affects many, many people all across the world today and has cost thousands of lives. We'll be talking about the effect of modern day witch hunts. It's going to be a very difficult episode to get through, but I still encourage you to come and listen to it if you can. And with that, please stay tuned, and thanks for listening.